It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jim Shevock, who in his retirement is a research associate and fellow with Cal Academy of Sciences here in California. But for 30 years, he had a botanical career working for the Forest Service and the National Park Service. And I want to get this right. Jim has 7 flowering plants, 8 mosses, and 2 liverworts named in his honor, including 2 whole groups of mosses, the genera Shevockia and Shevockia. Pretty cool. Welcome, Jim.
Well, good morning. It's great to be here to talk about some of my great and favorite plants. And so we'll give a real quick overview here of the bryophytes and what they are. So before we actually talk about what they can do, we need to kind of have a little bit of background from our general botany, which for the most of us, we didn't get very much about what are bryophytes. So I'm going to have to give you a real quick overview so we can actually see what they are so you can recognize them. Okay, so what are they anyway? Well, these bryophytes, we now know molecularly, based on the data sets, that they are the first land plants, and there are 3 of the 4 lineages of all the plants on the planet. So that's pretty substantial, and yet we've kind of just like ruled them out as being primitive, not important, and yet they've been around for a long time. They've seen every kind of climate change on the planet that it's had, and they're still here. And so they're remarkable in a lot of ways. This particular picture here of Apotrubia is one of the most basal members of the liverworts, and in its tissues, it has some endofungal relationships, which we believe give rise to the mycorrhizae. So these are some of the various earliest parts of plants making that association. So bryophytes play a real crucial role in tropical areas worldwide. That's where I've done a lot of my work now in the Philippines and in Taiwan and parts of China. It's really remarkable. And I just want to just really stress that, we've heard that, they're just lower plants, they're primitive plants, and that's really not true. They're remarkable. They're completely different from the flowering plants and ferns. Their whole evolution is completely different. We now know they're completely different lineages, and they've figured out a different way to be on the planet than everything else. So what is that? What makes them so unique and different? Well, first of all, they had to master 2 things. You have to deal with water availability and desiccation tolerance. And because of this, it's kept the bryophytes very small. And that's been their real dilemma. They're just right at the edge of our perception. We just don't really see them as individuals in the forest or in the landscape. They're just so small. So basically, they're 1 cell thick. So think about that, a leaf, there's only 1 cell thick. Just architecturally, the design of that is not going to make you get too big. So most of our bryophyte leaves are just a few millimeters in size. But the plant themselves can be quite large. So they also had to have, so when the rain comes, whatever's in that atmospheric rain or moisture, it goes directly in the tissue. There is no barrier of any kind. So as soon as that water hits, they are rapidly hydrated. And then at some point, when the environment's beginning to change, it starts getting hotter and drier, they have to get that water and release it and dry and basically go to sleep. So we have bryophytes that just shut down all cellular activity and go to sleep and wait till the next water event. And so we've had some things in herbaria for like 60, 70 years, and we've actually brought some of these specimens back to life. So bryophytes are just sleeping, waiting for that next event. So let's now look at the 3 basic groups. Hornworts are a very small group, about maybe 200 species worldwide. They don't have any leaves. There's a thallus. And so it's basically a green vegetative mat. And in hornworts, they like to be on soil. And so you'll see them primarily on soil banks of roads, exposed areas in the sun. So all the plant you see, they're all haploid plants. All the bryophytes are haploid, where all of our flowering plants and ferns are diploid. So that in itself is a huge, huge difference in their being. So here we have the horns, so they give it the hornwort, and that's the actual sporophyte. So the sporophyte is the diploid stage. That's the 2N. So on this particular hornwort, after fertilization, the sporophyte develops, and as it matures, it just splits open and the spores fall out, and they're airborne. And so that's how they move forward. Now we'll go on with the liverworts. In this particular group, there's two kinds of growth forms. There's the thallose liverworts and there's the leafy. And they make up about somewhere around 10 to 12,000 species, we think, in the world. And they're really, really common in more wet places. So like in California, because of our Mediterranean climate, we only have a little over 150 liverworts in the state. But we have many, many more mosses. But when you go into the tropics, just the opposite happens. The liverworts become dominant. So here we can see the sporophytes, these like umbrella structures. That's the two-end part. The spores are released. And on the bottom part of the slide with the simple thalloid, you can see that white stalk. That's like it's very, very short-lived. So most of these sporophytes, 3, 4, 5 days long. So very, very short duration. And the actual spore structure is this like olive structure at the tip of the sporophyte. And that's just going to split into 4 valves, and the spores are just going to rapidly disappear and get blown away. So they're very short-lived. So now we'll look at the leafy liverworts. So one thing about the liverworts is they're basically growing in one plane, just kind of creeping across the substrate. So you have the Fulania here. They can be various different colors, like this pink or reddish. But you can just see that they're basically grown like bird feather, just growing out across the stem, which is very typical of the liverworts. Another thing that liverworts have that other bryophytes don't have is oil bodies. And you can see the cells here, and again, there's one cell thick, and these compounds probably don't taste very well, so we don't have a lot of herbivory eating bryophytes. And you'll see later that they're mainly used for homes. So only the liverworts have this particular oil body compound. And now onto the mosses. They're the most speciose group of at least 12,000 species, or up to maybe even 15,000. We just don't really have a good grasp yet of how many. One thing that most mosses, the leaves are spirally arranged around the stem. And in this other part here, rhizonium, you can actually see a midrib, which we call in the bryophyte world a costa, because it's not really built structurally like a midrib on a flowering plant or fern. So it's going to have, so if you see a midrib, you know you have a moss. And also on the bottom part of Heuchera here, you can see small little specks, little green portions on the leaves, and those are gemmy. And most bryophytes have the capacity of producing new plants by asexual means. So these little gemmy just fall off. They're like little baby leaves, and off to the races they go. So like a little animal comes walking along, gets those gemmy attached to its body, and it just moves plants to another location. So there are some mosses that the sporophyte has never been seen. No one ever knows that it ever produced one. So it's just an asexual reproduction. Mosses also have a capsule here. That's the two-end part. And mosses, later on in their development, develop the capsule much, much more significantly than the liverworts. The liverwort just has that little capsule that just splits into 4 valves. But later on in the moss development, the capsules get very, very specialized. And at the openings, they have these teeth-like structures called peristome teeth. And they come in a variety of set numbers. And these teeth, with just in the atmosphere of temperature, those teeth move. And they can move, close the capsule, they can open up, they can reach down inside, spores can get attached, and then the spores can be released as the air current blows. So the spore release is much longer. It can take weeks for all the spores to get out of the capsule. So in this case, the moss capsule can last for a long time. And also the moss capsules can be quite different shaped. So you can see like columnar ones, tubular ones, twisted ones. But one thing they all have in common, all the bryophytes, is they have to deal with shutting down all cellular activity when they dry. So these leaves can twist and contort all kinds of ways, and it's very diagnostic in how we key them out. But the amazing thing, when they do all this contortion, they don't rip or tear the cell wall. And remember, we're talking about a leaf that's only 1 cell thick. So you think about it drying, it's not ripping that cell wall. The bryophytes here can be frozen, and those cell walls do not rupture. So they're architecturally amazing. So here's just some examples of the various ways the leaves, when they start to dry, so when they're hydrated, the leaves are out, and then when they start to dry, those leaves either bend across the stem or they twist and curl in all kinds of diagnostic ways. Now we get to one of my favorite places, the tropical rainforests. And here's now where bryophytes really come into play, because it rains every day there. And some of these mats on these trees, can be like this thick. And if you just take a grab of one of those mosses here on this slide and just squeeze it, you just get cups of water come out. They hold a tremendous amount of water, and they release that water slowly. And everything that lands on them in a liquid solution goes directly into that tissue. And then they release all these compounds slowly back in the environment. So a healthy forest is one with lots of bryophytes. And if you were to pull a piece of this bryophyte off the stem of the tree, you would just see unbelievable amounts of beetles, spiders, snails, worms, all kinds of invertebrates living in these forests. It's pretty amazing. On the other side here, the spirit ends. This is another interesting plant. These can form like tutu rings around the tree ferns. And there's only 7 species of spirit ends in the world, and they're only found on tree ferns. And I've always wondered, how does a species, as spores are blown through the forest, only land and know that that's the trunk of a tree fern? But that's where we find them. So it's pretty amazing. So they're good taxonomists. Now let's move to some of our temperate rainforests. Bryophytes are important here too. They carpet everything: branches, rotten logs, soil. So we actually go through this forest and roam around. There's just a lot of biomass. And they do the same kind of thing in the tropical rainforest, providing habitats for species, food sources. There's various birds that use certain species of bryophytes for the nests. So we see all that. But we also have in California, our climate is changing. And we have a lot more fires now in this kind of environment. And what happens when we have this kind of a forest burn up? Well, we have bryophytes. And we have here the fire moss, Funaria. And if you go to an area after a pretty substantial wildfire, that next season, later in the summer, the forest floor will be orange. And that's from all the sporophytes here on this plant. And this particular species is worldwide in distribution. And we basically only see it after fire events. So all these spores have been in that litter in that forest since the last time it burned. So how that single spore stays in the soil for 200-300 years before this forest burns is really remarkable. It also produces this beautiful skin on the forest floor. It's like a nursery stage, and then the flowering plants can germinate, keeping all that soil kind of moist. So it's just a nice protective carpet. We're going to hear more about soil moss, or soil crusts. There's a handful of bryophytes that you only see for a few weeks of the year. The rains come, they very rapidly hydrate. We kind of call them ephemerals, but they're really perennial. They're there all the time. And then they go rapidly into sporophyte production. And sometimes these soil crust species, the capsules are so large, they're not even elevated on a stalk. So here we can see the capsules right here in the base of these leaves, very, very few, and within a matter of a few weeks, they're all done for the year, and they move on. And because bryophytes have no roots, they can grow on all substrates. It can be rocks, trees, surface of leaves, soil banks, and they do a tremendous amount of erosion protection. It's like on soil banks, and here's the vertical walls, just carpeted in bryophytes. So normally, sometimes you're driving along the highway after the first good rain, and the whole road bank is just carpeted in green. And those are all bryophytes. They were there all during the summer months, too. They were just all darkened and dried. You couldn't see them or recognize them. Bryophytes in rivers, they're able to tell us a lot about water quality. I've done a lot of work in these kind of areas. They're very species rich, but I'm always kind of fascinated how they get attached. So look here in the picture, you can see bryophytes on these boulders, very smooth. Water has just run over these boulders for a long period of time, but bryophytes get established, either by a spore or a plant fragment. But it always amazes me this establishment phase has to be really problematic because it has to get there, get a foothold, hold on for dear life for the first big storm event and get washed away. And if you pull one of these specimens off the rock, sometimes through time, as the water flows over these boulders, fine silt and sand slows down and gets wedged at the base of the plant, and it keeps growing over that. And so if you pull that specimen off this rock, you can find up to 2 inches of soil, silt and sand. And it keeps those bryophytes even wetter longer. And then you'll find clams, snails, all kinds of larvae for fish. So it's really important if you have really good fisheries in freshwater streams, you're going to have lots of bryophytes. Here's a stream in Hawaii where the entire stream channel is carpeted endemic moss. And because mosses are flowing, in this case with the water, they can actually get fairly long. So this species of limbella can get almost 2 feet long. And some pendulous mosses growing in the tropics can also get about 2 feet in size. But again, most bryophytes are small when we first see them. Sphagnum. We've all seen sphagnum. You've seen bags of it in the nursery trade, used for all kinds of, potting your orchids and whatever. But they are super important for carbon. They store tons of it. And this is one of the basal groups of the mosses. In this particular case, as you can see the capsule here, it's on a very fine, whitish-looking stalk, and it's short-lived, quite different than the other mosses. So in a lot of ways, this kind of resembles more of the early liverwort in its sporophyte design. But instead of splitting in 4 valves, this one just explodes, and the spores are sent out into the atmosphere. Historic uses of sphagnum, a lot of indigenous peoples have used them for diapers. They're very antiseptic, so if you dry the sphagnum, you can use that, and it contains a tremendous amount of water it can absorb. And it's antiseptic, so you can see why indigenous peoples would have used it. And all the time up prior to World War I, sphagnum was used for a dressing because of its antiseptic properties. And for those of you who are Scotch drinkers, you need to thank sphagnum because it is the smoking of the peat that gives Scotch its distinctive flavor. So I'm a big, sphagnum fan. And sphagnum, there's about 200 species in the world. They're primarily in the northern hemisphere. And even several are quite reddish tinged, which is spectacular. So you see these big sphagnum bogs or fens of these very spectacular looking plants. The dung mosses. This is one of the most exciting little stories of bryophytes. It's a very small family of about less than 100 species. And here, this particular moss is constantly on the move. All the rest of the mosses and liverworts and hornworts want to stay stationary. They want to be in one place and stay there for a long time, but not the dung mosses. So they've evolved a strategy for being moved by flies. So they have spores, instead of being airborne spores, these spores are slightly sticky. So they're not going to be traveled by the wind currents, but they've developed an odor that smells like carrion. It attracts flies. The flies get the spores on their body parts, and then they go find some dung. So you can imagine in places where you have caribou and reindeer and moose, you have a lot of dung mosses. So those populations are constantly in the move around that environment. This is really, to me, just a phenomenal study. They're spectacularly colored, too. Now we're going to move on to conservation. And there's some of our challenges, and as we've already heard from the lichens, is our floras and our checklists that we have available worldwide are not great. There's certain areas, like in Europe, they've had a long history of bryophyte work, So there's good floras for that part of the world. We're working on our flora North America for the bryophytes now. But when we look at where the tropics are in third world countries, most of those areas with great species diversity, we have poor checklists or no floras at all. So it's really, really hard to help a country with either no resident bryologist or they just don't have the skills available to really get to figure out what's rare. Bryophytes, because of their size, that environment just above the ground where they grow can be significantly different than just a meter above. Just that the way that temperature and the air, the humidity flows across the bryophyte community, it's quite different. So just sampling bryophytes, we have to basically go slow and basically start looking at the different species on the habitat. Now, through time, we can identify most bryophytes to genus and some to species while we're in the field. But when you get in the tropics, it becomes a little bit more complicated because there's so many more species. The other complication we have with bryophytes is rarity and distribution. So I'll use some examples from California. So we've discovered this last year a moss here in the north part of the state. So we have one occurrence here in California in the Modoc Forest, and then we have to go to Patagonia to see the rest of that species. So we're talking about distributions of habitat where it can be hundreds or thousands of miles between occurrences, which is quite different when we think about our endemic flowering plants where geographical area is very restricted usually for rare plants. But for rare bryophytes, they can be at continental scales. We may have 2 or 3 populations here, a couple of populations in Pakistan and somewhere else, and that's the whole world distribution. So you can imagine how complicated it is to conserve a species like that. So that's one of the real challenges we have. So we have a distribution issue. We don't really have a good grasp what's rare locally and globally. But we do know, here even in California, that conservation, if we're not careful, we could actually lose some species because they occur in such small little areas, sometimes maybe a few square meters, and that's the only occurrence we know in California. So just random extirpations can occur, and we could lose a lot of our diversity, not because it's globally rare, it's just that it's rare here in California. I just want to thank my colleagues who provided me a lot of photographs here, just to show that now with the new camera technology we have, we can actually get pretty good images of bryophytes. And from that, it can help us to identify a lot of them and raise people's awareness of these beautiful plants, the services they do, water quality, water movement through this, soil protection, all these things they do for free. And we just have to kind of take a little bit of awareness of all the things that bryophytes do for us. Thank you. I think we got a couple of questions. Yes?
You mentioned early on that mosses are much more speciose or diverse compared to liverworts and hornworts, and I'm wondering if there's a reason why.
Can you repeat the question?
The question was, is there a reason why the mosses are more speciose than the liverworts? Is a general idea, but I think part of that is that the liverworts are concentrated in the tropics, and we just haven't done a really great job of inventorying them and describing them. I think that's part of it, but also mosses are more capable of growing in really dry environments, like even Death Valley. You don't think of mosses being there, but there's 100 species in Death Valley National Park. Just most of the year we don't see them because they're just under the ground or on a boulder. So liverworts need more water. So we don't find them in the real arid areas per se. So that would be one reason why globally I would expect more mosses. Yes?
If I heard you right, you said that they do not have roots. So how do they attach themselves?
That's correct. They do not have roots.
How do
They have
attach
little,
themselves?
well, there's 2 things that happen. When a spore germinates, it first becomes a little, what we call a protonema. And that little growth will kind of like work its way around a little piece of bark fragment or a crystal of a rock and kind of wedge itself. And as soon as that happens, then the first leaves develop. So they just kind of wedge themselves into that substrate, and they're off to the races. Once they're there, they'll just keep colonizing that habitat. Yeah, so they don't cause any problem whatsoever. Like bryophytes on your wall or on your roof, they're not penetrating anything, they're just sitting on it. It's just substrate. So the interesting thing about bryophytes too is, you know, once the flowering plants and ferns kind of came along, you had all this vertical habitat to now colonize. And bryophytes are great, and they evolved very rapidly when the vascular plants showed up. It was a whole new colonization of habitats for bryophytes, and they radiated out amazingly when the flowering plants showed up. Yes?
You mentioned that one of the challenges with being able to catalog and find where all these bryophyte hotspots are has to do with the fact they're very small over very large tracts of land. Have you thought about maybe using predictive spatial modeling to help narrow down where they could potentially be?
The microhabitats sometimes can be so small that it's really hard for like mapping kind of things to figure out where to go. I mean, sometimes I can think I should find species X in this part of the state, but it still takes a lot of work to find that specific little microhabitat.
Right.
So normally I try to find as many different microhabitats as possible that the common species don't want to be in. So when you look at the landscape, no matter where you go in the state, there's be a handful of species that occupy like 90% of the habitat. Then you want to look beyond those species to find the rare and unusual ones. And that's just training your eye. The other dilemma with bryophyte work is you need to have microscopes. Well, you could name a lot of things with photographs of things. To get really to the species level, you need a compound scope because we need to see those cells across the leaf. And the architecture of that leaf is different, so the cells can be different shaped and sizes across the leaf, and collectively, that's how we identify them. So I think we have room. One more question?
Okay, there's a lot of demand in the floral industry for mosses and lichens. The companies don't really like to divulge where they do the collection. What do you think about that?
Yeah, there's a real problem with wholesale going out into a forest and just rape and pillaging because these bryophytes are slow growing. It does a lot of damage to the environment. It is a real concern. Some forests have tried to regulate this by permit. For example, like if you're going to have a timber sale or something like that, you could go in there and basically harvest that before all those trees and that forest is converted. So there are things that you could do to reduce that thing versus just going out in the wild and rape and pillaging. You know, I think it happens in lichens too. Okay, thank you.